haven't gone yet. I'm trying to see if I can get somebody to get tickets for my birthday. That's awesome. Well, that's highly exclusive. I tried to get in for opening day. Hi, Senator Saffron. I haven't done anything with this. So yeah, I'm trying to go. It looks amazing. Several.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting of the Senate Finance Committee to order. We do have a conflicting subcommittee going on right now, so I apologize for our late start. We will not be acting on any bills this morning, so I'm not going to ask the clerk to call the roll at this time, but I believe we do have a quorum now. At any rate, we will not be conducting any official business, but we're here for the purpose of a brief briefing from our staff on the proposed amendments to the existing biennial budget. We also, we're still planning to be here to give us an update on revenue December. That will be tomorrow. Okay, so the only thing that we will accomplish is this briefing. Okay, anticipate a fairly detailed briefing. I really appreciate the attendance of other Senate members here, because this should give you a broad overview of our action. Actually, we do have a quorum, so I ask you to go ahead and call the roll.
Senator Powell. Here. Senator Sasslaw. Here. Senator Lucas.
Here.
Senator Newman.
Here.
Senator Ruff.
Here.
Senator Wagner.
Here.
Senator McDougal. Senator Vogel.
Here.
Senator Carrico. Senator Obenshain. Senator Barker. Senator Donovan. Senator Hamer.
Here.
Senator Norman. You have a quorum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Again, just a bit of housekeeping as we begin here, and Senator Norman's arrival here, but you'll find in your binders that you have in front of you, at the front of that binder is a policy statement of just basically an overview of our guidelines, procedures for the Senate Finance Committee. It addresses certain issues that we're trying to get annually, policies on tax credits and things like that. So I would ask you to review that. And you'll find the presentation for this morning's meeting behind tab 6. With that, Senator Norman, and actually we'll wait till the presentation. Senator Norman, you have additional comments? Good morning, okay.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Staff and I will give you an overview of what's in the governor's budget, and this will pick up a little bit in terms of where we were with our annual meeting in Blacksburg. As you know, the amended budget before you uses 780, Chapter 780 as the starting point, and that's the budget that you adopted in April. So what you're seeing are changes against that budget. And in a nutshell, the resources are reduced by $303.6 million. That reflects primarily that interim revenue adjustment that the governor presented to you all in August. And then that is a couple of additions to that. The Gaper Group added $233 million. There's roughly $144.5 million of tax policy actions. And there's also $567.2 million from the rainy day fund. So that's how you get from that $1.2 billion revenue downtake, if you will, to this net 303.6. And then on the spending side, you have a net reduction of almost $300 million. That's roughly $359 of new spending to address issues such as Medicaid and inmate medical costs, Children's Services Act, and you'll also see some discretionary spending of about $130 million for bonuses for teachers, state employees, state-supported locals, restoration of the compression pay, career development and constitutional officers. And then the other major funding piece is $31.7 million to address the state's mental health issues. That's offset by roughly $977 million of spending, the largest piece of which is reversing your compensation actions from last year. And I just wanted to hit on this briefly. We talked about this in Blacksburg, but to give you some sense of how we got to this revenue shortfall situation and the calendar that we followed. As you will recall, when you were here last year, you had well over $3.4 billion in additional resources, and that enabled you to do the compensation plan, the research initiatives, the additional funding for higher education and K-12. And then in February, you started to see signs of some weakness in revenues. That was our first hint of trouble. Based on collections through April, agencies were directed to slow their spending, and then by June, we had a pretty clear indication that a reforecast would be needed. July, sure enough, your collections fell short by almost $280 million. That was about a 1.5% against the budget. Revenues fell short by about 268, transfers 10.4. So in short, your revenues grew 1.7% against a forecast of 3.2%. And this just shows you in a one page how we came up with this 1.5 billion figure that you've heard bandied about. Primarily it's 279 from 16. That caused a problem in 17 because you were assuming 265 million rolling from 16 into 17. And that's why 17 was a harder nut to crack, if you will, in terms of trying to balance the budget. And again, picking up on the calendar, in August, the governor, as I said, gave you the revised revenue forecast. That took your revenues down by 1.2 billion. The growth rates went from 3.2% in 17 down to 1.7, and from 3.9% in 18 down to 3.6. I'd also point out that there was an explicit adjustment of 53.5 million made to the forecast in each year, and that reflects the conversation with the Joint Advisory Board of Economists as well as Gaker that there's something going on in the economy, something going on in our revenue collections process that we're perhaps not, our models aren't picking up. So there was this adjustment to reflect the fact that we don't exactly know what's going on in terms of why job growth isn't translating into income tax growth for us. Then in October, to be able to address this issue, the governor presented his plan that had savings for FY17, roughly $875 million, the largest piece of which was removing the FY17 pay increases. And I would note that there were no cuts to K-12, aid to localities, higher education, and most safety net services were exempt from those FY17 reductions that the governor proposed. And then rolling into about where we are right now, November, December, Gaker met yet again in fall, and at that point, just a few months later from August, things were looking a little more optimistic, and roughly $233 million of revenue was added back to that preliminary interim forecast. Roughly, most of it, it's about half and half corporate and withholding. Non-withholding was reduced, and sales tax was reduced as well. That just gives you a little bit of history. Next page, the resource changes. Again, just a snapshot of how we get to this $303.6 million. I've mentioned most of these things, the interim forecast, the Gaker adjustment, and then of course in the budget is introduced, you have technical and tax policy adjustments. The largest there is the tax amnesty, which Rick will talk about tomorrow. Again, just to show you some sense of where we've been in terms of revenue growth. We're looking at, we have 1.7% actual in 16, and the official forecast before you is 2.9 in 17 and 3.2 in 18. Year to date, we're at roughly 4% in terms of revenue collections. Again, Rick will speak to this tomorrow. You know, we're a little anxious that this is about where we were last year. Things were looking good, and then the next few months, things declined precipitously, so we're going to keep our fingers crossed on this. One of the big pieces of the solution to closing this gap is the rainy day fund, and what can be withdrawn from it is roughly half of the shortfall in each year. As you may recall, we have to put 600, it's a little perverse, we're putting $605.6 million in FY17. That's based on your FY15 performance. If you remember from this previous graph, we had a really good year. It was an 8% year in 15. That precipitated the deposit in 17 of $605 million. So that takes your balance up to 844, and the governor proposes to take 295 out of the fund in 17, and then 272 in 18, leaving about 277 million for you going forward. I mentioned a few times that there are some tax policy changes. Again, Rick will highlight some of these tomorrow. We asked him to give you a sense of the prior tax amnesty programs. We did it in 89, 2003, and 2009. I think that's right. And each time was a little bit different, he's told us, but we'll get some more information on that. That's expected to generate about 58.2 million, and on top of that, there's about 13.1 that goes to transportation and localities. I won't go through all of these because we're going to talk about them tomorrow. The next page has the details in terms of year by year what the impact is. Again, tax amnesty being the largest. Oh, I should also mention the accelerated sales tax. You may recall last year that you all took efforts to, again, try to unwind that. It had been, the cap had been 2.5 million per year in terms of annual sales. And in Chapter 780, you advanced that to 10 million in 17 and to 25 million in 18. The budget before you would keep it at 2.5 million in 17, but advance it to 4 billion in 18. And that gives you back 35.1 million in 17 and about 12.8 million in 18. So again, that's one of the tax policy actions in the budget that's introduced. Let me hit on the spending. As we talked about in Blacksburg, the major piece there is the Medicaid forecast. And then you also have 1.5% bonus for teachers, state-supported local, and faculty. This is in lieu of the 3% and the 2% compensation plan that you all provided last year. The Children's Services Act, there's caseload growth there, and I know that the Health and Human Resources Subcommittee is looking at that. The Mental Health Initiative I mentioned. The other compensation for compression and salary actions for state police that you all took last year, that has been restored and the budget is introduced. Inmate medical cost of corrections, that's a significant issue as well, and then you all can see the list. I know the subcommittee staff has been, the subcommittees have been looking at these issues, and the staff will touch on these in more detail. And then on the budget reduction side, I mentioned before that the biggest piece is the 346.3 million, removing the 2016 pay increases. Again, the bonus is intended to offset some of that. Across the board agency savings, I mentioned that higher education had been exempt, excuse me, from cuts in 17. There is a 5% reduction in the second year. Additional lottery proceeds, a couple of somewhat technical actions in terms of additional lottery and literary fund that cuts into or reduces the general fund in K-12, but there are no programmatic cuts or targeted cuts to K-12. A couple of other items here the staff will cover. I know there's been some interest in the Go Virginia reduction. That is $15 million. That would leave them with roughly $21.1 million based on your proposal. And let's see. And then just to give you on one page how we come to all of these numbers. Here's the 780, as you adopted it, the net resource adjustments by year, the spending adjustments by year, and you are left with a $16.1 million unappropriated balance. Mr. Chairman, any questions? I will turn it over to Mike Tweedy for opening.
Okay, all right, thank you, Betsy. We'll have detailed reports in each major area. Did anybody have any broad questions for Betsy at this time? If not, Mike, well, you're about HHR. Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In Health and Human Resources, which you can see from the, this is where much of the major additional spending is located. You'll see that for FY17, an additional $82.5 million, the net change to the general fund, and an additional $256 million for FY18, so for a total of about $339 million in additional general fund resources in HHR. When you dig into the details, what you see is mandatory spending, which is predominantly Medicaid and the CSA program. It's about $355 million. There were about an additional $57 million added for more discretionary spending. Half of that is basically the governor's behavioral health package, which I'll go over in a minute. And then there's about $73 million in savings in HHR. Only about 29 are actually ongoing recurring budget reductions. The remainder is actually adjustments to the cash balance and revenues to the healthcare fund, which is used to match Medicaid. Just very quickly, the major policy and funding items, just two things to note. The governor did not directly include Medicaid expansion in the budget, so he didn't factor in any savings of that nature. What he did do is he included language that allows him to expand Medicaid. As of October 1st, 2017, there remains some program in effect at the federal level that still provides an enhanced match for any expanded population. And it also struck the language that prohibits the governor from this expansion. The other major initiative of the governor's introduced budget was the behavioral health funding package. The actual overall package is about $31 million, but about $4.2 million is actually located in the public safety area related to jails. So within HHR, we have $27.5 million, and you can see that's broken out about $9.4 million for opioid treatment services, discharge assistance, which helps to get people out of state hospitals, as well as detoxification services. The major component of the proposal is the $8.2 million to create same-day access services at community services boards. So this is really the idea that you come into the CSB and you actually would be assessed that day. So this would actually go ahead and start to move 25 of the 40 CSBs to a same-day access services. There's also about $5.1 million kind of focused on state hospitals. About $3 million of that is to be used to help purchase private inpatient psychiatric beds to avoid the people from being admitted to state hospitals, and then about $2 million additional staffing to help deal with the increased caseloads in state hospitals. Last year, we also heard of $4.5 million for evaluation and design of a transformed mental health system. This is kind of thought of as a study, but there's a lot more detail in actually what it actually will do, and looking at how you actually operationalize and move the entire system to a more improved mental health system. And lastly, there's some money in there to purchase naloxone to be used in the community. So when you look at mandatory spending, like I said, Medicaid utilization and inflation, so this is based on the Medicaid forecast, about $255 million net for the fund. With the CSA programs, with $85 million, I'll address them a little bit more in a second. There's a few other things like adjustments to child welfare, which is federal and state adoption subsidies, and foster care costs, and required federal reinvestments of